Hello, everybody. Good evening, good day to all of you, and welcome to episode 4 of the Indian Interest Podcast. So let's see who all is there. I can see Tamagna, Sparkly, Dhruv, Daddy Shark, Jatin, Shravani, Purobi, Atharva, Sanathoibi, Tejas, Radioactive Cake 101, Chiching, Brock, Arant, Trupti, Sai Krishna, Rajarshi, Nilab, Trinay, Mahendradan, Sahil, and lots of other people. Great to see you all. Great to have you all with me tonight. And so today, what shall we talk about? What shall we talk about today? Usually, so the last few podcasts, the last few episodes of Ask Abhijit or Indian Interest, I have begun the podcast by talking about Ukraine, the Ukraine conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So let's talk about something else to begin with today. Where shall we go? Shall I go north? Shall I go south? Shall I go west? Shall I go east? Let's go south. And what is south of India? We have Sri Lanka. So, as you all may be knowing, Sri Lanka is going through a crisis right now. A crisis, an economic crisis. They have gone almost bankrupt. They've run out of foreign currency, foreign exchange, and they are desperate for some kind of bailout from somebody. Somebody, please help me. So that's where Sri Lanka is right now. That's the crisis they are facing. So, what has happened? What caused this crisis? And what is the way out? What does Sri Lanka need to do? And what does it mean for India? So, why don't we talk about that? Let's talk about that first. So, let's go back in time about 10, 15 years. So, from what I see of the Sri Lankan economic condition, uh, the crisis seems to the roots the origins of the crisis seem to go back at least a decade. So if you look at the Sri Lankan economy, it was doing reasonably well until about 12 years ago. And about 15 years before today, let's say from it was the rule of Mahinda Rajapaksa. So I think he came to power, I believe, roughly in 2005 or so. So he was in power from 2005 to I think 2015, thereabouts, a decade or so in power. And during this time, we saw the culmination of the Sri Lankan Civil War, which was between the LTTE separatist forces and the Sri Lankan government. And in 2009, the LTTE was finally defeated, and there was a terrible, terrible affair over there. Let's not go into that episode of history right now because it's not completely relevant to what we're discussing. So then, after 2009, Mahinda Rajapaksa was the undisputed leader of Sri Lanka, the great victorious leader. And Mahinda Rajapaksa is not just one guy, he has an entire family around him. They're all in politics. His brother's name, he's got, I don't know how many brothers, three brothers, four brothers. So his brother is currently the president of Sri Lanka, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and they belong to two separate political parties. So 2005 to 2015, thereabouts, Mahinda Rajapaksa was the undisputed ruler of Sri Lanka. And if you look at his family, they still have a stranglehold on Sri Lankan politics. One could essentially say that they own, why, whether it's illegally or legally, whether it's officially or unofficially, they own more than half of Sri Lanka, more or less. That's the kind of stranglehold they have over Sri Lanka. This entire family, the Rajapaksa clan, Rajapaksa family, the Rajapaksa dynasty, including their sons, whatever it is, right? So, beginning after 2009 or so, Sri Lanka started borrowing money from various places, whether it is China, whether it is the World Bank, the IMF, whether it is countries like Japan, countries or the international market or whatever. They started borrowing heavily. Now the Sri Lankan economy is a small economy. They don't produce much that can be exported, and it is a heavily import dependent economy. That's what Sri Lanka is like. And the Mahinda Rajapaksa started borrowing heavily from outside lenders. Now when you borrow money, eventually you have to give it back. So these whatever money you borrow is supposed to go into developing the country. And if you develop the country properly, then that investment will produce returns, ROI, return on investment. And that's how you can, the Sri Lankan economy should grow. And that's how you should be able to pay back the loans. But Sri Lanka is a deeply corrupt country. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. It is alleged by lots of people, lots of commentators, and so on, that the Rajapaksas are a very corrupt dynasty. So, what seems to have happened is that much of this money that was given as loans to Sri Lanka was eaten up by this ruling coterie, the Rajapaksas and their minions, their the people around them, the inner circle of power. And therefore, the Sri Lankan economy did not develop the way it should have developed if the money was used for the right purposes. And the Rajapaksas enriched themselves via these loans, and Sri Lankan economy did not grow. And eventually, it was time to repay the loans, and there's no money. There's no money for that. And there are other factors as well. For instance, the Chinese debt trap diplomacy also features in this. The Chinese are not entirely responsible for what's happened. It's just a small percentage of the overall crisis that is due to China. So the Rajapaksas, I think the Chinese loans were taken. I'm not sure whether it was during the Rajapaksa era or the Maitripala Sirisena era, which was from 2015 to 2020 or 2021. Roughly, you can look up the dates. So after 2015, it was Maitripala Sirisena who was the president of Sri Lanka for about 5 years, and then now we have the other Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is the president. And right now, Mahinda Rajapaksa is the prime minister of Sri Lanka, and they are in different political parties. How nice! So that they also took loans from the Chinese to develop the Hambantota port in the south of Sri Lanka, and they knew that they would not be able to repay the money. The Chinese also knew it, and eventually, what happened is that the Sri Lankans signed over the port to the Chinese on a 99-year lease. So now, essentially, the Chinese control that port. That is the Chinese debt trap diplomacy, the checkbook diplomacy, the corruption diplomacy in action. So some of it is because of China. Don't blame the Chinese, blame the Sri Lankan government. They agreed to these loan terms, right? Ridiculous loan terms. That they knew that they could not repay the loans. And they borrowed so much from various other international lenders, and they ate up most of the money. So the politicians, the Rajapaksas, enriched themselves at the expense of the nation. They took money for the nation, but they used it for themselves. So it must be sitting in their bank accounts somewhere, right? That's what is alleged, and that may most likely be correct. So that's what happened. That is the major portion of what the problem is. And also there are other problems. For instance, recently the Sri Lankans, they imposed a pesticide ban, a complete pesticide ban, a complete agrochemical ban in the country. And so that has caused a colossal food crisis. The agricultural production has dropped by at least 40%, because what happens is that if you don't use these agrochemicals, pesticides, then you have to do things by hand to keep 1 hectare of land weed free, pest free, by hand. It takes approximately 120 to 150 hours per year, man hours. And if you have thousands of hectares, just imagine how much human labor it takes to achieve what pesticides can achieve. So, so what happened is that the Sri Lankan, this is what happened. So this is one of the reports from the Deccan Herald. Sri Lanka's plunge into organic farming brings disaster. Food prices, vegetable prices shot up, and it's been a complete disaster. And it's interesting that this was all done on the advice of an Indian person whose name is Vandana Shiva. So she is apparently an Indian scholar, environmental activist, food sovereignty advocate, eco feminist, whatever that means, and anti globalization author. As you can see, she wears a gigantic, enormous bindi, which scares the heebie-jeebies out of me. So that's the person who advised the Sri Lankan government to impose this pesticide and agrochemical ban, and that has caused this enormous food crisis, which has made the prices, food prices, vegetable prices, everything shoot up, and that's what they're going through right now. And again, there's one more factor in all of this. Sri Lanka's economy is heavily dependent on tourism. I think 10% or more of the GDP depends on tourism. And then what we know what happened in late 2019, 2020 onwards, the COVID disaster, the COVID pandemic, because of which international travel stopped for a couple of years. So because of that, the Sri Lankan economy stopped receiving foreign exchange. Tourism is a major source of revenue, foreign exchange and all that, so all of that stopped. So that aggravated the crisis, and all of this together turned into a perfect storm. And now what's happened is that the Sri Lankans have gone bankrupt. The government has gone bankrupt. The country is bankrupt. They no longer have money, foreign exchange, to buy essentials like fuel for generating electricity. So there are these massive blackouts across Sri Lanka, 16 hours, 20 hours. Some places it's completely blacked out. They don't have the money to buy food grains, foodstuffs. They don't have the money to buy paper and whatnot. Yeah. So that is what Sri Lanka is going through. It is a heavily import dependent country. They depend on other countries for all kinds of things, and now that they no longer have the money to repay loans, they no longer have foreign exchange, they are in this deep hole which they themselves dug themselves into. So it is the government of Sri Lanka that is to blame. It is the politicians, the corrupt politicians of Sri Lanka, who have created the crisis. I would not blame China entirely. Of course, everyone knows what the Chinese were up to. They have this methodology, this checkbook diplomacy, the corruption diplomacy. So the Sri Lankans could have said no, but they agreed. So some portion of the crisis is because of China, but the majority, the overall big thing, is entirely caused by Sri Lanka's politicians. So now the Sri Lankans are going around with a begging bowl in their hand. I feel so sorry to say this. I have absolutely nothing against Sri Lanka. They are our own people. So the Indian government, I believe, has offered them about $2 billion as a line of credit. So that will hopefully stabilize the economy just a little bit for a little while, and they will be allowed to repay that loan whenever they can afford to. So the Indian government has not attached any stringent conditions on the Sri Lankan government, that you have to repay the loan within so and so time. I think it's kind of a blank check for now, right? Just to stabilize the country. Now the Sri Lankan what can the Sri Lankan government do? They could go to the IMF, the World Bank, and ask for deferring the loans they've taken, or ask for more loans or whatever. That is problematic. Now go back in time to the early 1990s, when India had gone through the same problem. The Indian government, well, yeah, it was behaving in much the same way as the Rajapaksas have been behaving, and India suddenly was in this foreign exchange crunch. It was running out of money. It had about 3 or 4 days of foreign exchange reserves left, and India was essentially going bankrupt in the early 1990s. And who was the government in at that time? It was the Congress government. I believe the Prime Minister was Mr. PV Narasimha Rao, and so India had no option but to go and beg, whether it was the World Bank or the IMF. I don't remember. You can look it up. It doesn't matter who it was. And they agreed to bail India out with strings attached, with conditions attached. So they agreed to give India the money to bail India out, but then they would tell India how to use the money. So there were all kinds of conditions attached. India would have to open up the economy to foreign investment, and all kinds of things. So that's how the so-called liberalization of the Indian economy happened in 1992, I think, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere there, 91, 92, 93, most likely 92. Look it up. And um, and that is where you have this slow, gradual, and pervasive Western infiltration into all levels, well, into various parts of the Indian system. That's where it begins. So because India was forced to borrow money from the West, from the IMF, the World Bank, they imposed all kinds of conditions on India, which made India open up itself, not just the economy to foreign investment, but other things also go into all this. All of these NGOs that exist today, which have foreign funding and all that, the roots of that problem lie in that economic crisis that India went through. So the same thing is what's happening to Sri Lanka right now. Sri Lanka already is deeply infiltrated by the West. Let's not go into the details of that, but If Sri Lanka were to go to the World Bank or the IMF for more money, then they would have all kinds of conditions on Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka essentially would become a Western vassal state more than what it already is today. So that's why Sri Lanka would rather prefer to borrow money from a country like India. Maybe they would, if they're desperate enough, they may even go to China again, or maybe somewhere else. Everywhere there are strings attached. I believe the Indian government also, for the sake of India's national interest, would impose certain conditions on which would perhaps not be publicized, but there would obviously be certain strings attached when it comes to bailing out the Sri Lankan economy. I believe it is in Sri Lanka's best interest to stick to India. I am sure India can completely bail out the country if the Indian government wishes to do that. But obviously, there is a quid pro quo. That's how it works in international affairs. Sri Lanka, the people of Sri Lanka are our own people. There is no difference culturally, religiously, ethnically, or anything between us and them. But today, they are a separate nation state, and therefore, the rules of geopolitics apply. So it is in India's interest, long term interest, to bail out Sri Lanka, to stabilize the country. We don't want another disaster there. We are already seeing a small, gradual trickle of refugees from Sri Lanka into India right now because they want to escape the disaster that's unfolding there. It's mainly, I believe, Tamil refugees coming into Rameshwaram and southern parts of India, Tamil Nadu, because that's the geographical region that abuts Sri Lanka. So we don't want a new crisis there. It is in our interest to stabilize the country, to bail them out as far as we can. It is in Sri Lanka's interest not to approach the World Bank or the IMF or the Chinese because they're gonna essentially buy out the whole country. They're gonna infiltrate the country, and turn Sri Lanka into a Western colony or a Chinese colony. So the Sri Lankans need to ask themselves, the government, not the people. The people have no power. The people, what can the people do? It's the people in power, the government, the politicians, the army. They have to decide what is in their long-term best interest. Now, I'm sure that there will be some checkbook diplomacy going on even now. There will be offers from the Chinese to the Rajapaksas of certain bribes. There may even be such similar offers from the West. But in the long term best national interest of the Sri Lankan people and the Sri Lankan nation, it is best that they deal with India, which is nothing but, well, the same civilization, the same people. So they will get the best deal from India and not from anybody else. So I believe it is incumbent upon the Indian government, the Indian Foreign Service, the Indian Foreign Minister, Prime Minister, etc., to make it abundantly clear to the Sri Lankan government that their best interest lies with India. India will give them the best possible deal, which will not be a deal that will cost them an arm and a leg and a pound of flesh. India will not make the Sri Lankans do that or pay that sort of a price for any help. The Chinese certainly will. The West, of course, will. So let's see how this goes. But that is what the Sri Lankan crisis, the current economic crisis, is all about. Their corrupt politicians, their corrupt government has brought this upon the nation and the people. And if things go bad, the Rajapaksas will fly out somewhere if they feel that there is nothing more left to extract from the country. But maybe the Indian government can work with the Rajapaksas and turn the fortunes of the country around. Let's see how that goes. So that is what is the root cause of the problem. That is where the situation currently is, and these are the possibilities that may come about. They may go to the Chinese, they may go to the West, IMF, World Bank, whatever, or they could stick with India and hopefully turn things around. So that is all about Sri Lanka and what's going on there. Now let's go towards Russia and Ukraine, because obviously we have to talk about it. That's the major burning issue right now. So let's not go into what is the situation on the ground in Ukraine and all. It's been dissected threadbare. It's happening everywhere. Let's talk about something else. Another aspect of this conflict, of this crisis, of the bigger picture of what's happening. So as we all know, as you all know, the Americans, the West, when we say the West, it means the Americans by proxy. So the West has imposed these sanctions, economic sanctions on Russia. Everything that they could do, they've done on Russia. So That has caused an economic crisis for the Russians. Now, the Russians, so what happened is that the Russian ruble, its value fell very rapidly when this entire crisis began. As soon as Mr. Putin ordered the Russian intervention, let's call it, in Ukraine, the sanctions were imposed on Russia, and because of the sanctions, the value of the Russian currency, the ruble, dropped dramatically. It became like worthless almost, right? Because there was no more demand. See, when something is in demand, its price rises. When there is something that is in short supply, its price rises. But when it becomes abundantly available everywhere, its price goes to zero. So if something is in demand, it's not enough to be abundantly available everywhere, it has to be in demand. So if something is in demand but it's abundantly available, its price is low. But if something is in demand but it's very rare to find, its price will be very high. So when a currency is no longer in demand, when it is sanctioned, then its price drops. And when your currency's price drops, you have to buy anything, you have to pay much more of your currency to acquire that. So that is a huge problem, right? It means that you have to pay much more in value of your currency to acquire something compared to what it was yesterday, that sort of thing. So that is what the Russian ruble has been facing, and that's what the Russian economy has been facing. Now let's talk about the US currency. The US currency is the world's reserve currency. It's been that way since 1945 or 1944. Look it up, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is when the victorious Americans, along with their vassal state, the so called allies, they decided to make the US dollar the global reserve currency. At the time, the US dollar was pegged to the price of gold, which means that the US dollar was a proxy for gold. You acquire a dollar, it means you are acquiring a certain value of gold. And the US government promised to redeem dollars for gold on demand. All right. So that's what the dollar situation was. It was on the gold standard. So dollars represented gold. Then you had in the 1970s, I believe, was it? During the reign of Mr. Nixon, you had this. Mm, you had a crisis in the Middle East, uh, and all the oil exporting nations, the OPEC nations, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they kind of decided to boycott the US, and they decided to no longer supply the US in the West with oil or something like that. Look it up, that crisis. And because of that, the value of the dollar dropped dramatically. And that's when Richard Nixon, and when the value of the dollar started dropping, people started dumping the dollar and asking for gold in return. And that became a crisis for the US, because it would have ended up eating up all of America's gold reserves. And the Americans did not want to let that happen. They wanted to hold on to their gold reserves, right? But they had made the promise that in exchange for dollars on demand, we will give you gold. So then what could they do? So what was done by President Richard Nixon is that he delinked the dollar from the gold standard. So then the dollar became free floating. It is no longer linked to the price of gold, to gold. And it essentially, what happened is that they turned it into a petrodollar. So the dollar came to represent petroleum, barrels of oil. So that is the kind of transition that happened. The petrodollar system originates much before that. The It is all linked with Saudi Arabia. The Americans had this understanding with the Saudis that they would purchase oil from them in dollars, and oil can only be any transaction with vis-a-vis oil can only be done in dollars. So that is, after that, the petrodollar system. So today, if you want to buy oil, if a country wants to buy oil, let's say a million barrels of oil or whatever from anywhere, the transactions are only done in US dollars. Any petrochemical uh, product is transacted in US dollars. And that is what makes the American economy so powerful. That's what makes the dollar so powerful. And that's why the Americans are able to impose sanctions on anyone they want, because their currency underpins all petroleum transactions and the entire global economy. So I'm just giving you a very brief, superficial explanation of what the system is like. You can look it up in detail. You can read about it. There's a lot written about that. So that is why the Americans are able to impose sanctions on anybody, because everybody is compelled, because of the global system, to use US dollars for all transactions, including especially uh, oil transactions. So now what's happened is that because they imposed sanctions on the Russians, the value of the Russian ruble plummeted precipitously. So what have the Russians done to combat that is the question. So what the Russians have done. About today is what is the date today? 9th of April 2022. About a week or two ago, look up the date, the Russians announced that the Russians are a major exporter of oil and petroleum products, of especially natural gas. I mean, the Russian natural gas exports are what power Europe. If the exports stop, then the Europeans will be forced to buy much more expensive gas, oil, etc. from the US. So the entirety of Western Europe depends on Russian petroleum exports, right? And the Russians have now demanded that anybody who purchases oil or gas or whatever from the Russians must pay in Russian rubles, not in US dollars. It will no longer be accepted. The payments must be done in Russian rubles. So suddenly there is a demand for the ruble, which means the ruble has acquired a new value. The ruble is again valuable, because if you want to purchase Russian oil or gas, you have to pay in rubles. So it is no longer toilet paper. It's suddenly again valuable. So that has stabilized the price of the ruble. But there is more to it. The Russians have now announced that they are linking the ruble to the gold standard, which means the ruble is now a proxy for gold. And they have announced that 1 gram of gold is equivalent to 5,000 rubles. So if you go to the Russians with 5,000 rubles, they are going to give you 1 gram of gold. But what's interesting is that this undercuts the value of the US dollar by 30%. Because to buy 1 gram of gold, you have to pay much more. The price that you have to pay in US dollars is about 30% more. So let's say you want to buy a gram of gold. You can pay 5,000 rubles, or you can pay the equivalent of about 6,500 rubles in US dollars, which means that it is now beneficial for you to purchase gold using rubles rather than dollars, because you're going to make a significant profit, 30% profit. And that is has stabilized the ruble even more. So let's take a look at what the situation has been like. It's fascinating what's happened. Let's look here. This is the chart of the price of the US of the ruble versus the dollar. It is USD versus ruble. So uh, in early February, where are we? Early February. This is the 1st of February. On the 1st of February 2022, the price, the ruble was worth 77 rubles for 1 US dollar. On the day of the invasion, it was 81 rubles for 1 US dollar. And then the economy crashed. The value of the ruble plummeted because of the sanctions, and it was 138, 139 rubles for 1 US dollar. And then it went down, then it went up. And then all of these measures were announced, and see what happens. The ruble is becoming more and more valuable again. And as of today, as we speak, the price of the ruble is 79 rubles for 1 US dollar. So the ruble has appreciated compared to the US dollar since February 24, when the invasion began. Can you imagine what happened? So they have been able to counteract US sanctions, and the ruble has actually increased in value since the day of the invasion, as of today. So that is how they, because of their ability, because of the stranglehold on the Western European energy market, and because they have decided to peg the ruble to the gold standard, because of these two measures, they have been able to stabilize the currency and the economy, and they have been able to actually make their currency appreciate a little bit as of today compared to when how it was on February 24. So that is the situation we are seeing right now. And what is really important, and what the media is not speaking about, the media is very quiet about this, is that if this continues, the value of the US dollar is most likely going to crash by 30%, because now it is beneficial for anyone to purchase gold using rubles rather than dollars, because you're paying 30% less per gram per kilo. So it makes sense to acquire rubles and dump dollars. That is terrible for the US dollar, for the US economy. So that is the financial, that is the economic equivalent of a nuclear attack. That is what we are seeing right now. So this is a situation that is currently in progress. It is a fluid situation. So let's see what the US does to retaliate against this. Will they be able to salvage the value of the US dollar, or is it going to plummet by 30% in the coming days and weeks? That's what we have to see. And because India is on the verge of, or maybe I'm not sure if it's already happened, but we have this rupee ruble agreement with the Russians to acquire Russian oil, gas, petrochemicals, whatever. So it will be beneficial for India as well if we have a rupee ruble agreement, because we will get more value for each rupee that we spend vis-a-vis the Russians, and they are already willing to give us very good prices. That's good for India. But as we know, the amount of oil that we purchase from Russia is very small compared to what we purchase from the Middle East, etc. But if this situation continues, maybe we should purchase more oil from the Russians, because it is good for us and our economy. And also, since we are talking about petrodollars and all that, the Saudis these days are not happy with the Americans. For the past God knows how many decades, the Saudis have been a US colony, a US vassal state. Saudi Arabia, whether you know it or not, is an artificially constructed country. It is a country that was constructed by the Western powers, essentially the British, by the British Empire. If you look at the map in the Middle East, it's all straight lines, etc., like you have in Africa, which means these are artificially constructed nations like Iraq, like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth, Oman, and so on. So the Americans, because their currency is linked to oil, that's why it has been very important for the Americans over the past few decades to control all global sources of oil, which is why they have a stranglehold and a vassal state relationship, master servant relationship with all of the Middle Eastern countries, especially the petroleum producing countries. So, and the Saudis have been big clients of the US. They spend like tens of billions of dollars every year purchasing American military equipment, which is interesting. So they are serving the masters. So now what's happened in recent times is that the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has deteriorated. The Biden administration is not favorably inclined towards Saudi Arabia. You have this cultural interference in Saudi Arabia. They used to be a very rigidly orthodox country, and now you see that the country has been opened up, and they now allow women to drive cars and wear regular clothes. They are allowed to show their hair and so on, which is a good thing. I have nothing against that. It is up to them how to run their country, but there seems to be an element of interference from the US, first of all. Secondly, the Americans have been very anti Saudi Arabia, especially after the Jamal Khashoggi incident. There was a Saudi dissident who was a US resident who was, obviously, we know, he was murdered by Saudi assassins. Where was it? Istanbul, was it? I think it was in Istanbul, or it was in a Turkish embassy somewhere. Look it up. I don't remember exactly what the details are. But the Americans have been very, very hostile towards Saudi Arabia after that incident, and so the relationship has deteriorated significantly in the last couple of years or so, right? So the Saudis now have agreed to supply oil to the Chinese in exchange for Chinese yuans, not US dollars. So the Saudis are now trying to cut the chain the master servants chain that they have with the US. That would not be good for the US. I don't know what the retaliation, the response is going to be like, but the Americans are not going to like this. So the Saudis are selling oil to the Chinese in exchange for the Chinese yuan. So, and the Russians want rubles for that, and India and Russia have a rupee ruble relationship. So it looks like right now that the stranglehold that the US dollar, the petrodollar, has on the global economy could, in the coming years, maybe in the coming decade, evaporate. It is possible. Of course, the Americans will do everything they are capable of to prevent this from happening. So it's an interesting phase of human history that we are currently witnessing on a day to day basis. So the ruble is now a golden ruble, and the petrodollar is shaky, and the yuan wants to be a petro yuan. That's where we are today. What about the Indian rupee? That's what the Indian government must look into. Should In the past, the rupee was pegged to silver during the British Raj era. They had pegged the Indian rupee to silver. A rupee used to be really, really valuable in the old days. It was like $1 versus one rupee. That was the kind of relationship we had almost in the 1940s. But then what happened was that the price of silver crashed somewhat, and then the rupee's value also plummeted because of that. And then it's a long history. As of today, the rupee is about 76 rupees for $1. So which is okay, which is fine. We don't need to change it too much. It should remain stable, but the Indian government needs to hopefully analyze the current situation and take advantage of how things are going to strengthen the Indian rupee, and by doing that, we will end up strengthening the Indian economy. So things are changing, and India must do everything it can to take the most amount of advantage of this changing situation. So that's about the golden ruble, the petrodollar, and all that. Now, I said that Saudi Arabia has been buying US weapons. It imports almost all of its weaponry from the United States. The Saudis don't make anything. They don't have any weapons industry, defense manufacturing industry, or any such thing. They acquire everything from the US. India acquires about 70% of its defense equipment from Russia. It's a very old relationship. We have been buying weapons, systems, etc., from Russia for decades, from the uh, from the beginning of the Cold War itself, from the 1950s and 60s onwards, right? Now the Americans are telling India that it is not in your best interests to continue buying weapons from Russia. You must take steps to integrate your military with our military, with the US military. You need to acquire. We will give you better substitutes for Russian weapons, but you need to buy our weapons. It's a kind of threat. They are kind of implicitly threatening India. Stop buying military equipment from Russia, buy American equipment. Now, as of today, India does use American equipment to a certain extent. We have those Chinook helicopters, heavy lift helicopters. We have Poseidon anti submarine aircraft, long range patrol aircraft. There is talk of India acquiring American drones. There are certain missiles, Javelin missiles. I'm not sure what it is. Those are also being acquired from the US. We have those attack helicopters, Apache attack helicopters, and various other things. So India is buying a certain amount of defense equipment from the United States. The Americans want India to integrate all of its equipment with the Americans, with their military. That's what they want us to do. India obviously will resist. So the question is, should India buy American weapons, US weapons? Now let's take a big picture perspective of this to understand what India should do. Let me show you something. What is this? This is a cell phone, right? We all carry cell phones today. We go nowhere without a cell phone in our pocket or wherever, right? There's always a cell phone on us. Now, this device here is an Android device, and the one that I have here is manufactured by, who is it? Samsung, most likely Samsung. So this is an Android mobile phone. which is manufactured by Samsung, which is a South Korean manufacturer, most likely. And FYI, it is important that I say this: South Korea is a US colony, it's a US vassal state. Now, this mobile phone that I have, it operates on the Android, it uses the Android operating system. The Android operating system is developed by an American company. It is based on the open source Linux operating system. Now, the version of Android that I have on this phone will be proprietary to the manufacturer. Every manufacturer of cell phones will have their own proprietary flavor or version of the Android OS. Right? Now, why are we discussing this? See, computers, whether it is cell phones or any device that uses computing, it has as at its heart something called a chip, which is an integrated circuit, IC. Right? So examples of ICs or chips are computer processors, CPUs, central processing units, microcontrollers that contain one or more CPUs, and so on and so forth. These are all manufactured somewhere by somebody. Now, do you remember something called the Trojan War? The Trojan War between Greece and Troy. The Greeks had imposed this years long siege on the city of Troy, but they were not able to break down the defenses. So, what did they do, the Greeks? They created this big wooden horse and they put it in front of the gates of the city of Troy, and they left. The Greek army left. And the Trojans started celebrating, yay, the siege is over. They opened the doors of the city, they brought in the Trojan horse, they had a good party, celebration, they went to sleep at night, and then the Trojan horse did its trick. There were soldiers, Greek soldiers inside the Trojan horse, who came out at night, opened the gates of the city, and by that time the Greek fleet had come back. And that's how Troy was destroyed. So a Trojan horse is essentially this term is still used today to talk about computer hacking, malware, etc. A Trojan horse is a hidden entrance which allows somebody unauthorized access or undocumented access to your computer system. So if you are a chip manufacturer, you can place Trojan horses, backdoors in the chip that only you know about. It's something that allows the manufacturer or somebody who owns the manufacturer unauthorized access into your computing system, undocumented access into your computer, whether it's your cell phone, whether it's your tablet, whether it's your laptop, whatever computing device you have. It may be something inside. Even cars have chips these days. Fridges, ACs, everything has a computer chip these days. So wherever you have a computer chip, there is the possibility of a backdoor, and backdoors are not hacked. They are designed into the system, they are built into the system. It's a feature, not a bug. So everybody who uses a cell phone is potentially being tracked. Their data is potentially being sent somewhere, whether it is to this country X, or country Y, or the country where this thing is manufactured, or somewhere else. You don't quite know, but that's what's happened. So they have penetrated deep into every country. I guarantee that every single chip in these devices has a backdoor. And whether you allow location sharing or not, or whatever else, your data is being shared somewhere they don't know about. So this is a feature, not a bug. So, how do you prevent your data from being hacked and used like this? Your country must manufacture its own chips, its own integrated circuits and microprocessors and microcomputers and controllers and all that. India still isn't doing that, but India is putting the pieces in place to create its own semiconductor ecosystem and industry. India needs to become a semiconductor manufacturing superpower. But I am talking about weapons, not semiconductors. So why am I talking about semiconductors and chips? Let me tell you a story. There is a fighter plane called the FA-18 Hornet. All right, it's a fighter plane. You can look it up on Google or wherever you want. So about 3 decades or so ago, the Americans sold a bunch of these FA-18 Hornets to their ally, Australia. So Australia is one of the countries that belongs to the Five Eyes Alliance, which is the US and four of its very close vassal states: the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So these are the five English speaking countries, and they are all essentially owned by the US, right? So the Americans sold a bunch of FA-18 Hornets to Australia. This is a complex, strategic, networked weapons system. That's what the FA-18 is. What does it mean? It means that the US has unified control and data centers that are robustly connected via networks and satellites to these FA-18 Hornets, these aircraft. So, a complex strategic networked weapons system can be turned off or partially or completely disabled remotely on demand by the operator or the owner. Hmm? So, what the Australians found is that they purchased these very expensive FA-18 Hornets to defend their country and their region of interest. This aircraft has something called a target acquisition system. And to acquire targets, that you want to destroy, there are certain system codes that are necessary to acquire enemy targets, to lock on to targets, and then to issue the command to destroy the target via missiles or whatever. So what happened is that the Australians found that when they were doing these practice runs and all that, that the targets they wanted to acquire and destroy, the plane would not lock onto those targets. The aircraft would not allow the pilots to acquire and lock onto those targets, and then there was no question of destroying them. So only the targets that the Americans allowed the planes to acquire were acquired. But any target that the pilot would randomly choose, let me destroy this thing, the plane would not choose the target. It would not lock onto the target. So essentially, the Americans arbitrarily denied their ally, Australia, access to the full system capabilities of the aircraft they had purchased for their own use. Isn't that interesting? They did this to their own ally, to their official ally. Australia is essentially a US owned corporation. That's what it is. And still, the Americans did not allow them to the full use of the systems they had purchased. Eventually, I believe the Australian programmers were able to create an alternative system and install that in the aircraft. And maybe after 15 or so years, or maybe 2 decades later, they were able to acquire full use of the aircraft they had purchased. Right? So, isn't that interesting? This is what the US did to their one of their closest allies. And it's not just about the target acquisition systems and full control, it's also about spares. One of the reasons why the Boeing aircraft company makes so much money is not because it sells big aircraft to all the countries in the world. It's because there is a continuous ongoing demand for spare parts. You can't, I mean, a plane, a Boeing plane or an Airbus plane, let's say, it needs to replace spare parts on a continuous ongoing basis. Every week, every month, you will need something that has to be replaced. There is this maintenance that is scheduled all the time, and you need to replace spare parts because there is wear and tear and so on and so forth. So one of the major ways in which these companies make money is by selling spares, and only they know how to manufacture the spares. So let's say you acquire a US aircraft, you will need to continuously buy purchase spares from the company, from the American company. We have the Indian Air Force has the Chinook helicopters. We need spares to keep the aircraft, the helicopters flying. We have the Poseidon uh, aircraft, which are anti-submarine aircraft and long distance patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. They also need spares. We need to keep purchasing spares from the Americans. The Pakistanis, in the 1980s, they bought F-16s from the Americans, right? And the Americans gave this to the Pakistanis when they were financing Pakistani terrorism in India. So the Pakistanis acquired F-16s. Clearly, the Americans. So this entire system of remote control, it goes back decades. It's not something that has emerged in the 21st century. It's been always there since the 1960s onwards. So the Americans have hundreds, maybe thousands of military satellites, remote sensing satellites, which control all of these weapon systems that they have sold to various customers and countries across the world. So the Pakistanis have these F-16s. Now, in 2019, there was this incident between India and Pakistan. One F-16 was shot down, one MiG was shot down. Our pilot was captured briefly by the Pakistanis, and we forced them to give our pilot back unharmed. Right? That's what happened. Now, they sent a bunch of F-16s, the Pakistanis, into Indian airspace. It's clear that the Americans could have prevented this from happening. They could have disabled the F-16s from launching, or when they realized the F-16s are going into Indian airspace, they could have turned some systems, weapon systems off or something like that. The Americans did not do that. They wanted to enjoy the spectacle with popcorn and Coke. So again, it tells you how reliable the US is as an ally. And this applies, this sort of remote control, target acquisition, and so on, the ability to turn off or partially disable these complex strategic networked weapon systems. This applies not only to aircraft, it applies to FA-18 Hornets, to F-16s, to helicopters, to anti-submarine aircraft, to anti-tank weapons, to shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger missiles, to strategic drones, to ballistic missiles, and anything that uses GPS navigation. During the Kargil War, the Americans denied the Indian Army the use of GPS. So that is the problem. So if India were to acquire US weapons, it would be totally dependent on the US, to the whims and fancies of the US government, as to what use it can make of these weapon systems and whether it can use them or not at all. That is the major problem India will face if it acquires US weapon systems. And you know what? It doesn't apply only to the US. You acquire French Rafales, even the French will have this the ability to remotely control certain parts, certain aspects of the Rafale aircraft. You acquire Russian weapons, even the Russians may have similar remote control, let's say over the S-400 or whatever else. But we know that the Russians have never prevented India from using weapons in the past. They have never ever disabled any feature of whatever they've sold to India. India has used Russian weapon systems multiple times on an ongoing basis in various wars and conflicts. So the Russians have never done that to India, backstabbing. The Americans did that during the Kargil War. So if India were to ditch Russian weaponry and decide to purchase US weapons in as a replacement, it could make India totally vulnerable to the US. It means India becomes a completely, in all ways, a US colony. And then they can tell us whatever they want us to do, and we will have to obey. That's why I would say it is imperative for India to stop purchasing weapons from other countries. India needs to develop its own weapons industry, and we are taking robust measures to do that. But it's still something that's going to take at least 10 to 20 years. I would say 2 decades. In the meanwhile, we should make sparing use of weapon systems from other countries, and certainly don't trust any nation. By that, I mean any nation at all. So that is the situation. So India should not purchase US weapons. India should not purchase weapons from any other country. That's what I would like to say. That is what would be the best for India's national interest, for the Indian interest. Right. So now I would like to address one more thing. Is the West evil? I mean, lots of people say that I am anti-West, I am pro-Russia, I am nowadays even pro-China, supposedly. So the major thing that is said is that I am anti-West. So is the West evil? Is that what I believe? No. The West is not. What do we mean by the West? Let's say that the West means Western Europe, the United States, the English-speaking countries, all of that. Is it evil? If you mean the people of the West, no. People are the same the world over. If you travel to other countries, you will realize that anywhere you go, whether it's in Africa, in Eastern Asia, in Northern Eurasia, Western Europe, or in the Americas, or anywhere else, people are the same everywhere. People have the same needs, the same wants, the same hopes, the same aspirations, the same desires. Everybody wants to live a good life. Everybody wants to live a peaceful, stable, calm, productive life. Everybody wants to be prosperous. Everybody wants to be happy. Everybody wants to have a good family, a happy family. Everybody wants their children to do well and have good jobs and good lives and their descendants to do well. That's what every single human being wants anywhere in the world. So I have absolutely nothing against the people of the West or the East or anywhere else. I want everyone to be happy. So what did they say? Sarva Sukhina Bhavantu, right? That's what we wish for the whole world. But that's not how it works. So, what exactly is it that is the problem with the West? It is this attitude of colonization, neo-colonialism, and so on, and imperialism. And that is something that the people are not guilty. It is not their fault that their governments do this. And when we talk about governments, there's only one real power in the West, which is the US. Now the US is an empire. It's the American empire. You can call it a superpower. The word superpower is a euphemism for the older word empire. So the Chinese are an aspiring empire, and the US is the existing empire. The US empire spans the whole globe, like we spoke about. Their currency is the global reserve currency, and so on. So the thing is that it's not just the US, but various other countries also that have these imperial tendencies. For instance, France controls a significant part of Africa by proxy even today, and so on and so forth. So the West is not evil. I have absolutely nothing against the people of the West or against Western culture. I have lived in the West on multiple occasions. I like the people there. Many aspects of their culture and their way of life are great, very nice. So nothing against the people of the West, nothing against any individual, but the overall policies that they pursue, the interference that they do in other countries, that is a big problem. It doesn't allow the world to evolve and grow organically, naturally. There's always interference. For instance, they talk about democracy. Now it's very nice to speak about democracy. Democracy is a very good concept. It's like when you say that I am a liberal person. I am liberal, you are something else. When you use the right words, whatever you do sounds good. So you have this American organization called the National Endowment for Democracy. So it is an arm of the US government, or maybe not. Maybe it claims that it is not an arm of the US government, but it's a very big, powerful, and very well funded organization in the US, the National Endowment for Democracy, that promotes democracy in other countries. What do you mean by promoting democracy? I mean, does every country have to follow the US methods and the US way of life and the US way of governance? What if certain countries have a system of monarchy? In Africa, across the world, you always had monarchies. And in certain countries, you have a one party rule. Maybe it's what the people want. I mean, the principle of the global world order, the rules based world order, is non interference in the internal matters of other countries. But then you have these organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, and I think there's another one called the European Endowment for Democracy, that actively interfere in other countries' internal affairs. So that, and by promoting democracy, what they're actually doing is they are promoting regime change. They accuse a certain government of being fascist, the leaders of being fascist, and they try to create new leaders, fund new political parties. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a new political party emerges and a new person emerges. And within a decade or so, they become relevant. They start winning elections here and there. Have you seen this somewhere? Have you? And new television stations emerge out of nowhere. The mushroom out of non-existence, and things like that. And various NGOs are funded with millions of dollars. Various scholars and journalists are promoted. This is all the process of regime change. They have done this again and again and again and again. The Spring, the so-called color revolutions in former USSR republics, what they did in Ukraine in 2014, and in certain other places that may be closer to your home. So this is the kind of interference that is unacceptable, but they can do it because they have the power. That is what matters in geopolitics. Power is the only thing that matters. Beyond power, nothing else matters. And you can talk about nice things and concepts like inclusiveness and diversity and pluralism and democracy and all that. It is all just eyewash. They are just trying to, the only uh, the only objective for them is to control the whole world. And it's not this. See, any power will do that. That is just the nature of power. So I am not against country X or country Y or country Z. Any power, any country will try and look after its national interest. If it requires interference in other countries' internal affairs, they will do that. If it requires going to war with other countries, invading other countries, they will do that. That's just how it works. So all of this talk about the rules based international order and things like that, it's just for show, it's just for talk. At the end of the day, the rules of geopolitics have been the same since the days of Vishnugupta Chanakya and even before that. So I am not anti West, I am not pro Russia, I am not pro China, I am only pro India. And whatever I'm saying is what, in my opinion, is the best course of action for India. So I am certainly not anti West. The West is not evil. Power is power. Power is not good or evil. You can use it for any purpose you like, but power is just the principal and most important factor in geopolitics, internal affairs, internal regional politics, and in human interactions, personal interactions as well. Because even in interpersonal interactions, when you interact with any human being in your society, in the country, in your city, in your town, in your village, there is a subtle power interaction. There is a subtle status interaction. You may not realize it, but you realize it subconsciously. So that is that is what it is. Power is at the basis of everything. These asymmetries are what drive geopolitics. There is nothing such as evil or bad. There is only your national interest and other countries' national interests. And depending on what you do with your country and your economy and your power, you may rise or fall. And that's how it goes. Now, there's one more thing that people talk to me about: the Mitrokhin archive. So recently, I spoke about, maybe a week or so ago, perhaps, about the fact that the USSR has done nothing to India compared to what the West has done, compared to what the English-speaking countries have done. The Russians, the USSR, did not enslave my country and my people for the best part of 500 years. The USSR and the Russians did not steal, plunder, loot $50 trillion worth of treasure from my country and my people. They did not conduct the genocide of 100 million of my people. They did not partition my country. And they do not issue sanctimonious warnings to my country today. The Russians have never done that. So some people say, Abhijit, you are wrong. The Russians infiltrated India with their KGB agents and communists. And look at what Vasily Mitrokhin said. Look at what the Mitrokhin archives states. Look at what Yuri Bezmenov has said about what they were doing in India. On the one hand, you have these incredible atrocities and crimes against humanity. On the other hand, you have a little bit of infiltration from the USSR, but people don't see the balanced perspective. So let me go deeper into this. You speak about the Mitrokhin archive. Let's go a little bit into that. So let's understand who Vasily Mitrokhin was. Let's go to Wikipedia. Statutory warning: Wikipedia is not a reliable source of information. I'm just going here for making this thing go as quickly as possible and for convenience. But please remember, Wikipedia is not necessarily a reliable source of information. So, what does this article say about Vasily Mitrokhin? He was a major and senior archivist for the USSR's Foreign Intelligence Service, the first chief directorate of the KGB. He defected to the United Kingdom in 1992, and he gave the West, the UK, a vast collection of his own handwritten notes purporting to be copies of original KGB files. This became known as the Mitrokhin Archive, and it exposed various Soviet agents and so on and so forth. So he defected to the West. He first went to the American embassy in Latvia. The Americans did not consider him, upon assessment, to be a credible source of information. They concluded that the hand copied documents could have been faked. So then this guy went to the British embassy, and the British decided to take him in. And they retrieved some 25,000 pages of files and so on. And he and his family were exfiltrated to Britain, and so on and so forth. So, what are the Mitrokhin archives? The Mitrokhin archive is a collection of handwritten notes, which this guy copied from apparently original KGB files, and that's what it is. And it talks about all kinds of things: KGB operations, blackmail operations, accused but unconfirmed, disinformation campaigns, installation and support of communist governments in various countries, assassination attempts and plots, penetration of churches, support of militant organizations and terrorists, and active measures in India, apparently. Hmm? So, this is the Mitrokhin archive. There is another gentleman called Yuri Bezmenov, who is alleged to have been somebody who loved India very much. That's what it is alleged. So he was a Soviet journalist and a former KGB informant who defected to Canada. He was stationed in India. He apparently grew to love the people of India and the culture of India. And he defected to the West and he gave anti communist lectures in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and published some books. That's his story in very brief. And he wrote a lot of pro American literature, gave a lot of lectures, and so on and so forth. And he spoke about the Soviet subversion model, which is about how the USSR infiltrated various countries and tried to subvert the population by controlling the media, the academia, and so on and so forth. So let me show one more reference, which is this article by Op India. This is not what I am saying, it is what Op India is saying. Let me be very clear about this. It's an article written on in Op India, and which is a publication that I, uh, to a large extent, admire. So the article is The KGB Ties of Indira Gandhi, How India Became a Puppet of the USSR During the Cold War. So it's based on the Mitrokhin archive. Mitrokhin reveals that Indira Gandhi was given 20 million rupees in exchange for crucial information and did not even return the bag or whatever. So it says that Vasily Mitrokhin, a KGB spy who defected to the UK, revealed all kinds of things. There are several chapters dedicated to India and the Gandhi family. Uh, Joseph Stalin had a poor opinion of Jawaharlal Nehru. He regarded Nehru and Mr. Gandhi as imperialist puppets who bowed before the British and betrayed their people. They helped the British tighten their hold over India. Now, and so on and so forth. After Indira Gandhi, given the code name Vano by Mitrokhin, became prime minister, the KGB managed to infiltrate deeper into the Indian government. Mrs. Gandhi came to power after the mysterious death of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri in the former USSR. Uh, all of that. And it says that 7 cabinet ministers from the Congress party were elected due to Soviet funding. The defense minister during Mr. Nehru's tenure, V. Krishna Menon, was also given Soviet backing. He purchased Soviet equipment instead of UK equipment, and so on and so forth. The Soviets had penetrated deep into Indian embassies, were extracting information via their agents. Several Indian diplomats abroad were seduced and later blackmailed into giving classified information. 77 elections, the campaigns of 21 non communist leaders were financed by the KGB. Espionage wasn't uncommon in India. India had become a playground for various foreign espionage agencies, and so on. So these are the things that are claimed in this article. All right, so that's what the claim is. It is all based on the claims of Mr. Vasily Mitrokhin. Now, let's understand this. It may be true there is a significantly high probability that all of this is true. So let's assume hypothetically that all of the claims made in this article and made by Mr. Mitrokhin are true. So the question is, how much money was stolen from India as a result of this espionage? They actually gave money to Indian politicians. They did not steal money from India. How many Indian people were killed? Was there a genocide? Was there a massacre of Indians? Nobody was killed. Nobody was genocided. Did India became did India become the slave of the USSR? Not quite. It claims that India became a puppet of the USSR. Okay, it's a claim, but the Soviets stole nothing from India. No money. They actually funneled money into India to control politicians, and there was no massacre of Indians. So these are the things that the Soviets did not do compared to what the British did. Now, can we trust all of this, it is quite likely that at least some of these claims will be true. So, what was the intention of the Soviets? The Soviets were afraid. They considered Mr. Nehru and Mr. Gandhi to be uh, puppets. What is the word? What is the word they used? Uh, where is it? They considered imperialist puppets. The Soviets considered Mr. Nehru and Mr. Mohandas Gandhi to be British imperialist puppets, and they were concerned that India would slide into the Western orbit, and they wanted a big country like India to be on their side. So that's why they subverted Indian politicians, maybe Indian media, maybe Indian academia, to influence the minds of Indians to elect politicians who were pro USSR and so on. But what harm did it really do to India, even if this is true? Not much compared to what the British did to India. Absolutely nothing compared to what the British did to India. And every country, whether you like it or not, indulges in espionage and tries to buy out the politicians and the media of other countries. Every country does that. I promise you, India does that too. Hopefully, I hope it does. So, is that something bad? Why bring morality into geopolitics? That's what everybody does. That's what you expect every country to do. Let me tell you something that you most likely don't know. The Israelis have a standing rule for their military officers, whether it is the lowest rank soldier or the highest rank. If an Israeli military officer, whether in uniform or out of uniform, accepts a ride from a vehicle, from a car that bears foreign diplomatic plates, then that individual is immediately court martialed. So various embassies across the world, they have special license plates on their cars that identifies the vehicle as belonging to a certain country's embassy. So if an Israeli military officer, whether it is on duty or off duty, accepts a ride on any foreign diplomatic vehicle, that person is court martialed. Why is that? Because the Israelis consider every single embassy from any other country on their soil to be indulging in espionage, which means they consider even the Indian embassy as something that indulges in espionage. And therefore, it is clear that we Indians should also consider all foreign embassies to be centers of espionage, including the Israeli embassy in India. Please understand that. That is simply how geopolitics works. It's not about friends or enemies, good or bad, evil or non evil. It is how it works. So I don't see the USSR as, if it is true what Mr. Mitrokhin and other people claimed, if the USSR did that, they did it for the benefit of their country, their people, their national interest. Don't blame them, blame the Indian government for allowing this to happen. Right? So, and the other thing I would like to say is that we cannot take all of these claims at face value. Mr. Mitrokhin may have been from the USSR, but he became an American agent, a Western agent. Mr. Yuri Bezmenov, he may have been from the USSR, he became a US agent, a Western agent. This claim that he loved the people of India and the Indian culture, what actual hard evidence do you have of that? It's just words, it's just a claim. My point is very, very simple. Be skeptical. You want to trust? Sure, trust, but verify. Trust, but verify. Can you verify the authenticity of these claims? Mr. Bezmenov's archive, the Mitrokhin archive, is handwritten notes. He could have pulled it out of his imagination. There is no actual evidence that all of this is factual and genuine. And it is well known that he became a US agent. And so the same goes with Mr. Bezmenov. So you have to see things in that context and perspective as well. Maybe it is all American propaganda. There could be a significant amount of truth to the Mitrokhin archives, maybe 60, 70, 80%, but maybe 20, 30%, or maybe 10% would be strategically placed to further US national interest, Western interests, which is propaganda. So we have to be very clear about this. You cannot simply blindly trust something. You have to verify it at every step. You have to have an attitude of deep skepticism as to every new claim that you come across. Use your intelligence, look it up, do your due diligence to verify each claim that you come across. Don't just believe it blindly. Indians are so believing, so gullible. Oh, this person loved India, therefore I should trust everything he says. Arey bhai, what's the evidence you have that he trusted, that he loved India beyond a certain Wikipedia article or some article in a Western publication? Don't believe it, don't trust it. So that is what I would like to conclude today's session with. Do not trust everything. Do not believe everything you hear. Be skeptical. You want to trust something, you verify it first. Verify at every stage. Keep verifying. Do your due diligence. Don't blindly trust anything, anybody, anywhere. That is what is in the national interest. All right, my friends, thank you very much for watching this. Thank you very much for your presence. And I will see you next week in the next episode of the Indian Interest. Tomorrow we have the latest, the newest episode of the Ask Abhijit show. So please let me know what questions you have, and I will try and answer as many of them as I can. I will see you tomorrow. Until then, take care. Thank you very much. Bye.